So these are the 10 most important events in Michigan's history, thought up by me, Kristofor Camaj. So the first event, 1668, Father Jacques Marquette and Claude Dablon established the first mission at Sault Ste. Marie. So in 1668, French missionaries, Claudette Dablon and Jacques Marquette, founded a Jesuit mission at this site. So Sault Ste. Marie developed as the third oldest European city in the United States west of the Appalachian Mountains, and the oldest permanent settlement in the United States. In contemporary Michigan State. So on June 4th, 1671, Simon François de Mont, a colonial agent, was dispatched from Quebec to the distant tribes, proposing a Congress of Indian Nations at the falls of Saint Mary between Lake Huron and Lake Superior. Trader Nicholas Perrot helped attract the principal chiefs, and representatives of 14 indigenous nations were invited for the elaborate ceremony. The French officials proclaimed France's appropriation of the immense territory surrounding Lake Superior in the name of King Louis. In the 18th century, the settlement became an important center of fur trade, when it was a post for the British-owned Northwest Company, based in Montreal. The fur trader John Johnston, a Scots-Irish immigrant from Belfast, was considered the first European settler in 1790. He married a high-ranking Ojibwe woman named Azhagwan-Sakamwegwe, the daughter of a prominent chief. She also became known as Susan Johnston. Their marriage was one of the numerous alliances in the northern areas between high-ranking European traders and Ojibwe. The family was prominent among Native Americans. First Nations, and Europeans from both Canada and United States. They had 8 children who learned fluent Ojibwe, English, and French. The Johnstons entertained a variety of trappers, explorers, traders, and government officials, especially during the years of the War of 1812 between Britain and the United States. So the next important thing was in 1701, June 24th, Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac, a 43-year-old French army officer, selects a site at Lake Detroit, the Straits of Detroit, which is the waterway between Lakes St. Clair and Erie, and establishes a French settlement. So Detroit is the most populous city in the U.S. state of Michigan, the largest city on the United States-Canada border, and the seat of Wayne County. The municipality of Detroit had a 2016 estimated population of 672,795, making it the 23rd most populous city in the United States. The metropolitan area, known as Metro Detroit, is home to 4.3 million people, making it the second largest in the Midwest after Chicago. Detroit is a major port on the Detroit River, so here's why I think what's the second most important part. So Detroit is a major port on the Detroit River, and it's one of the 4 major straits that connect the Great Lakes system to St. Lawrence Seaway, and the Detroit Metropolitan Airport is among the most important hubs in the United States. The city of Detroit anchors the 3rd largest economic region in the Midwest, behind Chicago and St. Paul, Minneapolis, and the 14th largest in the United States. Detroit and its neighboring Canadian city, Windsor, are connected through a tunnel and the Ambassador Bridge, the busiest international crossing in North America. Detroit is best known as the center of the U.S. automobile industry, and the big 3 auto manufacturers, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, all have headquarters in Metro Detroit. So my next point, In 1763, May 7th, during the Indian Wars in the area, Pontiac leads a 135-day siege of Detroit. Indians capture all the forts in Michigan except Detroit. Pontiac's rebellion begins with a confederacy of Native American warriors under Ottawa Chief Pontiac, and he attacked the British force in Detroit. After failing to take the fort in their initial assault, Pontiac's forces made up the Ottawas and reinforced by Wyandots, Ojibwas, and Potawatomis, initiated a siege that would stretch into months. As the French and Indian Wars came to an end in the early 1960s, Native Americans living in former French territory found the new British authorities to be far less conciliatory than their preceders. In 1762, Pontiac enlisted support from practically every Indian tribe from Lake Superior to the lower Mississippi for a joint campaign to expel the British from the formerly French lands. Now, according to Pontiac's plan, each tribe would seize the nearest fort and then join forces to wipe out undefeated settlements. On July 31st, a British relief expedition attacked Pontiac's camp but suffered heavy losses and were repelled in the Battle of Bloody Run. Nevertheless, they had succeeded in providing the fort at Detroit with reinforcements and supplies, which allowed it to hold out against the Indians into the fall. The major forts at Pitt and Niagara likewise held on, but the United Tribes captured 8 other fortified posts. At these forts, the garrisons were wiped out, relief expeditions were repulsed, and nearby frontier settlements were destroyed. So the next important thing that I thought was in 1805 when the Michigan Territory was created, with Detroit designated as the seat of the government, and Michigan Territory was established by an act of the United States Congress on January 11th, 1805, and it was effective to June 30th of that year. So the act defined the territory as all that part of the Indiana Territory, which lies north of a line drawn east from the southerly bend or extreme of Lake Michigan, until it shall intersect Lake Erie, and east of a line drawn from the said southerly bend through the middle of said lake to its northern extremity, and thence due north to the northern boundary of the United States. So that was just their whole entire description of the state of Michigan in words rather than a picture. So a historical marker at a roadside park approximately 3 miles east of Namwimwe at 46 north, 83 west, commemorates the northernmost point of Lake Michigan, which is located approximately 1 mile west of that park. So the first territorial governor was William Hull, and he abolished Wayne County and established new districts of his own making, which provided to be short-lived. Now Lewis Cass became governor in 1813 and promptly undid Hull's work and reestablished a third incarnation of Wayne County that included all lands within Michigan Territory that had been ceded by Indians through the 1807 Treaty of Detroit. Now during the War of 1812, following General Isaac Brock's capture of Detroit on August 16, 1812, the Michigan Territory was at least normally a part of the province of Upper Canada. Now on August 24th, Colonel Henry Proctor proclaimed the continuation of civil government under existing laws with Proctor acting as governor and Chief Justice Augustus B. Woodward acting as secretary. On February 4th, 1813, Proctor suspended civil government and imposed martial law. Now my next main point that I found was an important date for Michigan was in 1812, Detroit and Fort Mackinac were surrendered to the British during the War of 1812, and the surrender of Detroit was a humiliating loss for the Americans at the start of the War of 1812. Now after Isaac Brock and British forces took Fort Mackinac, Brock decided to make an attempt at Fort Detroit near the western edge of Lake Erie, which was occupied by the Americans under William Hull. Now Hull had plans to raid the British fort at Amherstburg, but elected to retreat at Fort Detroit after the defeat of Fort Mackinac. Brock, along with the native chief Techume, formulated a plan in which they made their small force seem much larger than it was by lighting many fires and lining troops in strategic formations, fearing an onslaught, and completely fooled the British. Hull quickly surrendered the entire fort, including 39 cannons and 2,500 muskets. 2 large detachments of soldiers were also surrendered. The American defeat prevented from the invading Canada and gave British a stronghold in Michigan. So my next point was in 1837 when Michigan is admitted to the Union as the 26th state of the United States. So more than 200 years earlier, when French explorer Roulet visited the region in 1622, some 12 to 15,000 Native Americans lived there, and Sault Ste. Marie, the state's oldest town, founded in 1668, which I talked about in my first point, at a site where French missionaries had held services for 2,000 Ojibwa in 1641. The Ojibwa, along with the Ottawa, helped the French establish a thriving fur trade in the Great Lakes region. And Great Britain acquired control of present-day Michigan in 1763 and administered it as a part of Canada until 1783. When it was ceded to the United States under the provisions of the Treaty of Paris. And organized as part of the Northwest Territory in 1787, Michigan became a separate territory in 1805. So my next point is, in 1908, the Ford Model T is first manufactured. So the Ford Model T, known as the Tin Lizzie or Leaping Lena or the Flivver, is an automobile produced by Ford Motor Company from October 1st, 1908 to May of 26, 1927. It is generally regarded as the first affordable automobile, the car that opened travel to the common middle-class American, and some of this was because of Ford's efficient fabrication, including assembly line production instead of individual handcrafting. The Ford Model T was named the most influential car of the 20th century in 1999. Oh, in the 1999 Car of the Century competition, ahead of the BMC Mini, the Citroën DS, and the Volkswagen Type 1. Ford's Model T was successful not only because it provided inexpensive transportation on a massive scale, but also because the car signified innovation for the rising middle class and became a powerful symbol of America's age of modernization. So with 16.5 million sold, it stands 8th on the top 10 list of most sold cars of all time. Now, although automobiles had already existed for decades, they were still mostly scarce and expensive, and unreliable at the Model T's introduction in 1908. Positioned as reliable, easy maintained, and mass market transportation, it was a runaway success. In a matter of days after their release, 15,000 orders were placed. The first production Model T was produced on August 12, 1908. And left the factory on September 27, 1908. So about a month and 10 days. At the Ford Piquette Avenue plant in Detroit, Michigan, on May 26, 1927, Henry Ford watched the 15 millionth Model T Ford roll off the assembly line at his factory in Highland Park, Michigan. Several cars were conceived by Henry Ford from the founding of the company in 1903, before the Model T was introduced. Although he started with the Model A, there were not 20 production models A through T. Some were only prototypes. The production model immediately before the Model T was the Model S, an upgraded version of the company's largest success to that point, the Model N. The follow-up was the Ford Model A, rather than the Model U. The company publicly said this was because the new car was such a departure from the old that Henry Ford wanted to start all over again with the letter A.